So today we are in 1 Kings. We left off in 1 Kings 19 last time, where we saw the battle of the gods, in a sense, between Yahweh and between Baal, with the prophets of Baal and Elijah, and the return of rain. But then basically Jezebel, I keep wanting to say Isabel, so I've got to make sure not to do that. But Jezebel sends Elijah a threat, and he has to run away. She says, if may the gods kill me if I don't kill you within 24 hours. So Elijah runs away, and he's very down. He's at a point where he is suicidally depressed. He is saying, God, what good is this? I showed that you were the true God, and people did turn to you, but he says, really, this didn't make a difference. I don't really see what's going on. So God sends an angel to him. He gives him food and water. He gets him up, and then Elijah goes to what famous mountain in biblical history and theology? He goes to a mountain, to Sinai. Yep, he goes to Sinai / Mount Horeb, which is, if you see Sinai or Horeb, those are the same mountain. And he goes there kind of like Moses to kind of meet God, start everything over. That's where God started out. That's where Moses started out with the nation of Israel, in a sense, after Egypt. And so he goes there, and he's in the cave, and the word of the Lord shows up and he says in 19:9, speaks to him, says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he says, I'm kind of stuck. And so God says, okay, come outside, I'll show you, And so Elijah thinks God is coming, which he is. So he puts on his mantle and covers his face and goes outside, kind of puts his coat over himself to hide himself from the full glory of God. But he says there's a tornado, basically, this wind that's so strong it's breaking up rocks. Okay? And it says, but then God's not in it. He's causing it, but he's not in it. And then there's an earthquake, and he thinks, okay, God must be coming now. God's not in the earthquake either. Then there's this fire. Sometimes God appears in fire or as a fire, right? A consuming fire, but he's not there, right? And then in 19, how does God actually show up to Elijah? Not in those big ways, but in a what? A what? No. A gentle breeze. God comes and speaks to him quietly. And so what he's showing by that is that God doesn't always work through, these major obvious ways where there's direct intervention. Sometimes God's working, God's ruling over circumstances is imperceptible, meaning we don't see what God is doing, how God is doing things, exactly why God is doing things a certain way. But God teaches Elijah, look, I can work behind the scenes without you knowing about it and still rule over these things, even if it doesn't look like there's success, even if it doesn't look like I'm in charge. And so, but he tells Elijah at this point that he says, look, there's going to be judgment. You've asked for the judgment of God. He says that's what's going to happen. But it's kind of a situation of being careful what you ask for, because he says, yes, I'm going to send prophets after you. Elisha, Jehu, other prophets, and there is going to be purging. There is going to be judgment in Israel. They are going to kill people. They are going to execute people. All the people that have bowed to Baal and kissed Baal, he says, are going to die, and I'm going to leave 7,000 people behind. Okay, so not that he's going to go kill 7,000 people, which is a lot, but that there are going to be 7,000 people left who haven't bowed to Baal. So it's like God says, yes, I'm very serious about my judgment, but it may happen in a way that happens quietly, right? And it also is going to happen through, at the end of 1st and 2nd Kings, it's going to happen through exile. God's going to use other nations to judge Israel. Okay, now at this point, Israel, the northern kingdom, goes to war with Aram, this nation called Aram, which is the region we know today as Syria. Okay, and so they are going to war with each other. Syria is kind of like a big enemy to the north, kind of the threat that's recognized at this time. And now they're going to focus on them, but they're not going to be the ones that push, that come and bring the exile on Israel or Judah, but they're the biggest kind of enemy in their sight at that time. Okay, so Ahab teams up with a king who is actually a good guy for the most part, who does follow the Lord, who does get rid of false worship, and who in Chronicles we have a story of where Jehoshaphat goes up in battle, not with soldiers, but actually just brings people who play instruments, and they sing and worship the Lord, and basically are able to overcome the enemies on the other side without weapons. And so Jehoshaphat does follow the Lord, but he's acting really dumb here because he thinks, okay, there's this threat of the Arameans, or there's this war. If we team up, we can kind of beat them. Okay, so he puts himself in a bad situation, as we'll see that Jehoshaphat acts pretty dumb. So here's the situation, and you can fast forward to 1 Kings 22 here. Jehoshaphat and Ahab are there in the northern kingdom, and Ahab says, okay, we're going to go to war. And he says, here's what we'll do. I have all these prophets of Baal who will tell us how this is going to go. And of course, they're just going to tell him what he wants to hear, basically. Okay, so so Jehoshaphat is a worshiper of the true God, and he says, okay, can we hear from a prophet of Yahweh on this? Because he knows that a prophet of Yahweh is only going to speak what God's word is. He's not going to just tell them good or bad what the person wants to hear. The point here is, God rules from his word. But that Ahab says, well, yeah, there's this one guy that's imprisoned here that is a prophet of Yahweh named Micah, whose name means who is like God. And so he says, yes, there is a prophet here, but it says in verse 22:5, moreover, Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, please inquire first of the word of Yahweh. So remember, God rules through his word. That's the focus of Kings. And so he asks about this, but then there's this funny verse that I want somebody to read here. And after Jehoshaphat asks in verse 7, he says, is there not yet a prophet of Yahweh that we may inquire of him? Because he doesn't want to listen to the prophets of Baal. Can someone read 22:8? This is what Ahab says when he says, yeah, there is a guy, Micaiah, but Vivian.
And Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary.
No, this is in 1 Kings.
Oh, I'm in 2 Kings.
We're not quite there yet. That's all right.
Okay.
You guys will like this verse.
Verse 8?
Yes, please.
Okay. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, there is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micaiah the son of Imlah, but I hate him, for he never prophesies good concerning me, but evil.
Yeah, I always like this verse because it's he says, yes, there is one prophet of Yahweh, but I hate him. Because he always prophesies bad concerning me and never good. Meaning, which he doesn't get. Like, he thinks that prophets work like the prophets of Baal, where they, can kind of manipulate the gods or the spirits, rather than just report what God has said, whether it's good or bad. And so he says, yes, there is a prophet of Yahweh, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, but I hate him. So I've always liked that since I was like in junior high, and I remember hearing this, but I hate him. So they bring him in. And at first, Micaiah actually, he's kind of funny. He responds in a sarcastic way where they say, look, okay, now tell us, we're going to go up against the Arameans. Are we actually going to win? Okay. And so he responds so he says, should we go or not? And Micaiah actually responds in a sarcastic way in 22:15. And he says, go up and succeed, for Yahweh will give him into the hand of the king. And then the king said to him, how many times must I adjure you to speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of Yahweh? So he's like, I hate this. This is why I hate this guy. Because he knows, he says, he always says bad stuff is going to happen to me. So he knows that when Micaiah says, yeah, you're going to go and you're going to win. He goes, I know that's not what God told you. You tell me the truth. You tell me the bad things that are going to happen to me because you always say bad things. So he's like, I do like hear that. How many times do I have to tell you? So reminds me of a video my sister and I made when we were pretending we were on this like, I don't even know what you call it, telethon, and we'd have we'd switch it over. We had things making our voices funny, so we'd basically switch, and one of us would be the caller and one of us would be like receiving the call and talking to the person. And she said something and I was like, rephrase that. And she was like, how long have you been doing this? And I was like, rephrase that. And she goes, how long? And just repeats it louder. So anyway, but anyway, so Micaiah says to him, okay, so he does speak. So he says, so he said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep which have no shepherd. And Yahweh said, these have no master. Let them each return to his house in peace. So in other words, the shepherd's going to get killed. They're going to scatter. Okay. Now this will be important because Moses was said during his time that God looked on his people and they were like sheep without a shepherd. Moses talks about this. Jesus in at least Matthew 9:36 has compassion on Israel because they are like sheep without a shepherd, right? So when the king is not acting right, he's not being a good shepherd of his people. Okay, so he says you're going to lose. And then the king, this is verse 18, then the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, did I not tell you he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? He's like, I knew this guy would give me bad news. Isn't this what I said? Now, Micaiah tells him something that's huge here, which has been behind the scenes, but now is made evident, made obvious. Can somebody read 1 Kings 22:19? Because Micaiah gives him more information. Yeah, Eli.
And Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the moons of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left.
Right, so now he says, now hear the word of the Lord. God rules through his word. Micaiah gives him a prophecy and says, look, now I'm giving you the real revelation of what's going on. Heaven is opened, and what has been behind the scenes is now brought to the forefront and shown to be the case, shown to be obvious. Okay, he says that I saw the Lord, I saw Yahweh doing what?
Sitting on his throne.
Sitting on his throne. That God is the king, God rules, that he rules his word by his word. Even when people disobey, he rules in those circumstances as well. So not only does God rule, but he overrules, meaning he is the one who is actually in charge. And he doesn't always have to intervene in a direct way, like parting the Red Sea. But sometimes God intervenes through what we call his providence, which is God using the means of human life and existence and things going on in this world. He uses those details to bring about his purposes. So Ahab thinks he's doing whatever he wants, because he is. He's doing exactly what Ahab wants to do. But God is using those circumstances to bring about ultimately his purpose. Now, this verse will be important later because it sounds like another prophet who says, I saw the Lord seated on his throne, high and lifted up, lofty and exalted. The train of his robe filled the temple with glory, and the whole earth was filled with his glory. What prophet says that? That it kind of sounds like what Micaiah says here. Who has this vision of the Lord. This is also where the angels are flying around saying, holy, holy, holy. They have the 6 wings. Yeah.
Is that when Jesus is born?
No.
Revelation.
No, it does pertain to Jesus, but Old Testament prophets, Old Testament survey too. Majorly important prophet. Who's it from? No.
David.
No. Who's the prophet has the vision of the Lord on his throne?
Isaiah?
Isaiah. Yep, Isaiah 6. One of the most important chapters for God's goal of his glory in really the whole Bible. Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1, Daniel 7, Revelation 4 and 5, putting those all together, but we see a little glimpse of it here. So that'll be important later. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne. And so we see that he rules here. Kind of interesting fact to tie in here. John, in the Gospel of John, speaking of Jesus, puts together Isaiah 6 and Isaiah 53 and says, Isaiah wrote of Jesus' glory for he saw him. And it says in John 12 that the person seated on the throne is Jesus, okay? Which you can prove from Isaiah. We'll prove that when we get there as well. Okay, so God rules. They go into battle, and Ahab comes up with a plan to try to protect himself, and Josiah is really dumb and goes along with this plan. And the plan is this. He says, they're going to be looking for me as the king of Israel to try to kill me, the shepherd, and all the sheep will be scattered. So he says, here's what we're going to do, Jehoshaphat. I'm going to dress up like a normal soldier, and you're going to dress up, you're the king of Judah, but I'm going to have you be dressed up as the king so that the eyes and the target will be on you and not on me. Because God hasn't said anything bad is going to happen to you. And Jehoshaphat goes, okay, and goes along with this plan. Okay, so it's not very smart, but he's not being very smart at this time. But they go into the battle, okay, and it's pretty severe what's going on here. And then can somebody read 1 Kings 22:34? 22:34, yeah, Timmy.
Now a certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel, and a joint of the armor.
Okay, so who gets struck with an arrow?
The king.
The king, yep, Ahab. So Ahab's dressed up like a normal soldier, and it says that this guy drew his arrow at what? Random, yeah. It literally means, so it's not like Legolas in Lord of the Rings where it's like a sniper thing where he specifically hits this guy just in the right spot. It's that this seems random. This guy has taken an arrow and just gone like this, and the arrow happens to go right between the spot, I'll turn it this way because it's actually on the heart side, right between this spot and his armor, pierces this artery that is going to bleed out. He's mortally wounded, going to die. But it gets through this one little area, and he's not dressed up as king, and it seems like this is all like just this, well, that was lucky, that was fortunate, that was random. But according to the Bible, right, nothing's random. God has already said that this is going to happen. So even in events that seem random, and this guy wasn't thinking, okay, I'm going to do God's purposes, I'm going to, fulfill what God wants. He had no idea. Ahab thinks he's doing whatever he wants, right? So it's kind of like, I used this example earlier, and we have to be careful with this term because different people mean different things by it. But when people talk about, well, what is the role of free will, which better way to say this is in what ways are we responsible before God, in our choice and decision making? I think is better than calling it free will. That being said, Ahab is free in a sense. He's doing whatever he wants. But in doing whatever he wants, God's doing whatever he wants too. And God is the one whose actions, whose decrees are determinative of what goes on. And he can even work through things that seem random, and he can even work through people's sin and disobedience to accomplish his purposes. So he's that sovereign. Now Ahab dies, and his son is bad. Ahaziah takes over the throne and rules. Now turn the page over to 2 Kings, which is really the same book, just continued. And Ahaziah keeps trying to get kind of Elijah to be favorable to him. So he sends out men to go kind of collect Elijah and to bring him to him and make him prophesy for him. And so Elijah's seated on this mountain, and Ahaziah keeps sending out messengers with 50 men to go pick up Elijah. And Elijah keeps praying to God, and God keeps striking them down with fire from heaven, killing all 50 people. And then he sends them out a second time. And those 50 people get struck down with fire from heaven. Then he sends them out a third time. The third guy leading them is wiser. He himself just walks up to Elijah on the mountain and says, look, you've killed the people before me. He goes, can you please just come and talk to Ahaziah? And he goes with him. Kind of interesting, in the Gospels, John and James, the brothers, they are offended when at one point Samaria, which the Jews usually walked around instead of walking through, but Jesus and his disciples walked through it. This is where Jesus had spoken to the woman at the well in John 4 and preached the gospel to the Samaritans, told them he was the Messiah, all these things. Well, Samaria at a certain point doesn't let Jesus and the disciples walk through there. And the disciples are offended by this. And James and John say, hey Jesus, would you like us to call down fire from heaven and destroy the Samaritans? And Samaria was the capital of Israel. So he said, can we be like Elijah and kill these people? And Jesus tells them no, because that's not what he's there for at that point. But that's what they're trying to think, that they're going to be like Elijah in that sense. So that's what they're referring to. Okay, now Elijah, he ends his ministry, right? How does Elijah end? What happens to him?
Chariot.
Yep, chariots of fire take him to heaven, right? So he never dies. Yeah, like Enoch. There are a few people like this in the scriptures that don't experience death, but are just taken to heaven. And so his role and his ministry passes on to Elisha, similarly named prophet, who's actually going to, in some ways, even though he's not as well known, he's going to kind of extend the ministry further than Elijah. And so Elisha, and there's others, there's a prophet named Jehu as well who will be significant, but Elisha is able to do miracles. He's able to do miracles not only in Israel, but also show God's power outside of the land of Israel and among the Gentiles. So as other kings are going here, there is judgment. He provides bread to multiple people, even in Gentile lands. And this is why in the Gospels, did you guys know there's a feeding of the 4,000 and a feeding of the 5,000 that Jesus does? Did you guys know those are two different events? Okay, so there's multiple. There are different locations, and the point of talking about both of them is actually that Jesus is similar to Elijah. He shows that God's not only powerful through him in Israel, but he gives food to the Gentiles and shows God's power up there as well. So God is showing those things through Jesus is doing a similar ministry to Elisha and Elijah. Elisha follows Elijah, and then he raises the dead, goes to a widow, raises her son, cures leprosy, this Gentile named Naaman who comes to him from Aram, from Syria, and he's in charge of these people, and he has him go wash himself in the Jordan 7 times. He comes up and he's cured of leprosy. He causes an axe head to float that had fallen into a river, and it comes up to the top. Okay, so Elisha shows that God is God everywhere. He also brings judgment. Israel, there is serious purging that takes place that he facilitates. Okay, so there are different kings going on during this time, mainly in Israel. He talks about Judah as well, somewhat, but kind of Israel is kind of brought to the forefront. There's times when Elisha they try to capture him, they try to poison him, but this stuff doesn't actually work. So we continue to see that God is ruling through his word, through Elisha now carrying on that ministry. Jezebel dies in chapter 9. Okay, there are assassinations of these kings taking place. God judges Ahab's house. Okay, and then in chapter 11, right, we get a really bad queen named Athaliah who wants revenge for basically, she was the mother of Ahaziah, which is another king here, but she is a really bad queen who's in the south, okay, and she makes a plan to get revenge to kill off the Davidic line. kill, because there's multiple family lines in the north. There's only the Davidic family line in the south, which is the seed promise, the Abrahamic promise, the Davidic covenant comes through this line, eventually getting to Jesus. And so she has a plot to assassinate and murder every person left in the Davidic house that can carry on the family line and the family name. And she kills most of them, except this one guy, Joash, who escapes. God allows Joash to be hidden, and so redemptive history at this point, the seed promise comes down to one person that carries on the Davidic line. Okay? It came that close. We know that God is still in control. That being said, you have to see from a human perspective that it got very tight at this point of almost not being able to go forward. It was a satanic plot to try to overthrow the promises of God. So this guy Joash does become king, and he does some good things, while the priest who kind of raised him is still alive. But when that guy dies, Joash becomes bad as well. Okay, so there's not a consistency there. Elisha dies in he dies in chapter 13. 2 Kings 13. Okay, so now there's that moving on of time. Okay, and in the south, in Judah, you have a good king take over named Josiah. Okay, now it's important in Isaiah 6:1, Isaiah says that he saw the Lord in the year that King Josiah died. So this is during the time of Isaiah. Okay, and there is a king named Zechariah over Israel during that time. Okay, then there's a king in Judah who Isaiah prophesies to named Ahaz, who basically is going to team up with God's enemies to fight another enemy, and God says God's going to send Assyria against you if you don't listen to him. Okay, so eventually it gets down to this guy named Hosea, which this is actually the name Joshua as well, just in a different form, who is in charge of Judah and Israel. And it says in 17:6, it says, Israel in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, captured Samaria and carried Israel away into exile, and settled them in Halah and Habor and the river of Gozan and the cities of Medes. Okay, so they go in. This guy Hoshea, the end of Elisha actually dies before this, but so I'll put this up here. But now the northern kingdom has gone into exile. Okay, so 1 Kings 13. Okay, and it explains here in verse 17 verse 7. Now it came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nation whom Yahweh had driven out before the sons of Israel, and in the kings of Israel which they had introduced. It says the sons of Israel did things secretly which were not right in the sight of Yahweh their God. Moreover, they built for themselves high places, and from the watchtower to fortified cities. Okay, so basically, they facilitated false worship. Yep.
Can I get a tissue?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so this takes place, tells us in 2 Kings 17. Okay, and so Israel falls because of their idolatry, particularly the idolatry of their kings. And so now the focus will exclusively be on Judah, and the question will be, did they learn the lesson? Did they learn the lesson from what happened to the northern kingdom? Okay. Now in the south Judah, you have a bad king, Ahaz, who says, I'm going to team up with God's enemies to fight my enemies. And Isaiah comes to him and says, no, don't do that. You need to trust the Lord and he'll deliver you. And he says, and Isaiah says, okay, ask for a sign. I'll have God do a miracle and he'll show you that you can trust him. And Ahaz says, I don't want to test God. And Isaiah says, fine. Then God is going to give you a sign. The virgin will be born with child, and his name shall be Emmanuel. And by the time he is born, he will grow up eating curds and honey, which means he will grow up in a time living off the land in the period of exile because you didn't listen to God. We'll get to that in Isaiah 7. But Isaiah says that the Messiah is going to be born, Emmanuel, God with us. He's going to be born in exile because of your sin. Okay, and then he says, and by the way, he says, the nation that you fear shouldn't be the Arameans, shouldn't be Syria. You should fear Assyria and Babylon. Okay, now a really awesome king takes over after Ahaz, named Hezekiah. Trusts the Lord, takes down false worship, takes down the high places, which no kings do. And you start to think maybe this guy's going to be the guy that God uses as his true king to turn everything around. But then he gets sick, and God delivers him. He doesn't fully trust God. He gets this boil on him that he's like, am I going to die? And they say yes. And then he asks, Isaiah, he's like, can God, deliver me? He says, God will give you a few more years. Okay, and so he does get healed, but we see he kind of doesn't fully trust God. But then Hezekiah thinks, okay, to avoid the issue with Assyria, we're going to make a treaty with this newer nation who we think they're going to be kind of helpful with us. We're going to make a treaty with Babylon. Why is that going to be a problem?
Babylon's bad.
Babylon's bad?
Because God said not to ally with any other nation.
Yes, but ultimately Babylon's going to be the one to do what?
Be bad.
Conquer them.
Conquer them. Yeah. So he makes a treaty with them, but he's there in 586. They're going to be the ones that take over and bring them into exile. So Assyria will lose power by that time, but God says, "Look, you're teaming up with the person who's eventually going, the nation who's eventually going to turn against you, and you're going to be taken into exile as well." It's not going to be for some time, but that's what happens. Okay. Now, after Hezekiah, who is alive during the ministry of Isaiah, after Hezekiah, there is a really terrible king, probably the worst king of Judah, named Manasseh, who is really bad, and is really bad all of his life. And 1 Kings doesn't talk about this, but actually Chronicles does. Talks about at the end, he repents and God forgives him. And it's like you'd expect God's judgment on this person, but God actually forgives him and shows Israel, look, if you turn to me, I will still forgive. No matter how bad things have been, God always calls people to turn to him. Throughout the prophets, he's always saying, look, this is going to be really bad for you. You're going to experience my judgment, but you need to turn to me. And most of the time they don't. So Manasseh takes over. He moves things closer to exile. His son Ammon also moves things closer to exile. And then there's the takeover, this is through some time, of a really good king named Josiah, okay, who we will talk about next time. But Josiah rediscovers the law of God, okay, and rebuilds the temple, gets rid of the high places, gets rid of the false worship, gets rid of the cult prostitutes in the land, restores the law, and he is ruling and is repentant when he reads the word of God and wants to follow God. And this is all really good. The problem is, listen to 2 Kings 23, and I'll just finish here with verses 25 and 26. It says, this is what it says of Josiah. It says, before him there was no king like him who turned to Yahweh with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might, according to the law of Moses, nor did any arise after him. So Josiah, besides like David or Solomon, is Israel's greatest king. Because he repented, he turned to the Lord, and it says that he turned to the Lord with what? All his heart and soul and might. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and might. But he's not able to deal with a certain thing. There's been so much sin, so much building up of consequences, that Josiah is not ultimately able to deal with God's wrath. Listen to 23:26. It says, however, Yahweh did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, with which his anger burned against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. Okay, so he says, look, I'm not going to bring the exile in the time of Josiah because he turned to me, but it will still happen. So wait a second. But Josiah turns to the Lord and does the right thing, and God honors that. But Josiah is ultimately not able to deal with God's wrath. Even a righteous king like Josiah cannot fully deal with and satisfy the wrath of God, which is why, what do you need the king of Israel ultimately to do? They have to ultimately deal with God's what?
Right.
God's wrath, right? That's what we need, why we need Christ to actually deal with God's fierce wrath, justice against sin, and to actually satisfy that, not just to have God ignore that. Okay,